In 2003, a Chinese astronaut named Yang Liwei went where no one from his country had ever gone before. He orbited the Earth. He looked down at the country he'd spent his life defending, and when he came back, reporters asked him the question every Chinese schoolchild grows up believing has an obvious answer. Could he see the Great Wall from space? He said no. He couldn't see it at all. This single sentence from a man who had nothing to gain by lying triggered a small national identity crisis. Because for decades, in textbooks, in trivia games, in a claim so repeated it feels less like a fact and more like a law of physics, people had been told that the Great Wall of China is the only man-made structure visible from space with the naked eye. It isn't. It never was. And the wall itself is barely the most surprising thing you don't actually know about it. Here's what almost nobody tells you. The Great Wall isn't one wall. It was never built by one man, in one place, for one single purpose. It's not even, strictly speaking, great in the way you're picturing a single continuous ribbon of stone marching across mountains from one end of a map to the other. What you call the Great Wall of China is actually a patchwork of dozens of separate walls built by different dynasties in different centuries using different materials for reasons that sometimes had nothing to do with keeping anyone out. Some sections were built to keep people in, some were built and abandoned within a generation. Some were never finished at all. And large sections of the wall you think is still standing today have already crumbled into dust, been quarried for farmhouses, or vanished so completely that satellite surveys are still finding pieces of it that nobody remembered existed. Along the way, this monument has collected more myths, more urban legends, and more genuinely strange conspiracy theories than almost any structure on Earth. Some of them are silly. Some of them are the product of Cold War propaganda, and at least one of them touches something dark enough that Chinese archaeologists still argue about how honestly to discuss it. Tonight we're taking apart the Great Wall of China, myth by myth, lie by lie, and rebuilding what's actually true. Some of it is stranger than the fiction. Let's start with the myth so famous it might be the most successful piece of misinformation in human history. You've heard it. Everyone has heard it. It shows up in encyclopedias published decades before satellites even existed, in classroom posters, in pub quizzes, in offhand comments people make while looking at photos of Earth from orbit. The Great Wall of China, allegedly the only human-made object you can see from space with the naked eye. The claim is old enough that it predates actual spaceflight by more than a century. As far as historians can trace it, the idea shows up in print as early as 1754 in a book by an English antiquarian named William Stukeley, who compared the Great Wall to Hadrian's Wall in Britain and speculated with no way whatsoever to test the idea that it would be visible from the moon. Note that, from the moon, not from low Earth orbit where actual astronauts fly. From the moon 250,000 miles away. This wasn't a scientific claim, it was essentially poetic exaggeration, dressed up as a fact that got copied from book to book for 200 years by writers who never questioned it because it sounded plausible and nobody could check. Then space travel became real, and instead of killing the myth, spaceflight somehow made it stronger, because now people assumed astronauts must have confirmed it. They hadn't, quite the opposite. Multiple NASA astronauts have gone on record saying the Great Wall is essentially invisible to the naked eye from low Earth orbit, which is where the International Space Station and most crewed missions actually operate, roughly 200 to 250 miles up. At that altitude, the wall is simply too narrow. In most places, it's somewhere between 15 and 30 feet wide. Compare that to a modern highway, which is easily wider, or an airport runway, or the geometric grid of a large city, all of which are far easier to pick out from orbit because of their width, their straight uniform edges, and the contrast they create against natural terrain. The Great Wall, by contrast, is built from materials, rammed earth, local stone brick, that are often nearly the same color as the mountains and hills it runs across. It doesn't stand out. It blends in, which ironically was often the entire architectural point, a defensive structure that uses the landscape rather than fighting it. Astronaut J. Apt, who has flown multiple shuttle missions and later became director of a science museum, said flatly that the Great Wall is not visible to the naked eye from orbit under ordinary conditions. You need a long lens, ideal lighting, and honestly, you usually need to already know exactly where to look. Astronaut Eugene Cernan, who commanded Apollo 17 and remains one of the only humans to have flown to the moon, said the same thing even more directly. From lunar distance, no human-made object is visible with the naked eye at all. Not the wall, not any city, nothing. The idea of seeing it from the moon isn't just wrong, it's not even in the right category of wrong. It's not difficult, it's optically impossible given the physics of human vision and the size of anything humans have ever built. So why does the myth survive so stubbornly? Partly because it's a genuinely satisfying story. Humanity's greatest fortification, visible across the vastness of space, a monument to endurance so massive it defies scale. It flatters both the wall and, by extension, the people who built it. And partly because it's one of those facts that feels too good to fact-check. Nobody wants to be the person who ruins a good trivia answer. But here's where the story gets more interesting than the myth it replaces. Because the actual size of the Great Wall, the real, measured, argued over size, is stranger and more contested than visible from space ever was. Ask 10 people how long the Great Wall of China is, and you'll probably hear the same number from most of them, about 5,500 miles, or roughly 8,850 kilometers. That figure has floated around for decades. It's wrong, not because someone lied, but because for most of history nobody had actually gone out and measured the thing properly. It's an old structure spread across some of the most rugged terrain in northern China, partially buried, partially collapsed, partially just gone. Measuring it accurately requires an enormous archaeological survey, and until relatively recently, nobody had done one. In 2009, the Chinese government finally commissioned exactly that, a multi-year, high-precision survey using infrared rangefinders and GPS mapping technology, walking and scanning the wall's route in painstaking detail across 7 northern provinces. The results, announced in 2012, blew past every earlier estimate. The Great Wall, counting all its branches, all its parallel and looping sections built across more than 2,000 years by different dynasties, measures approximately 21,096 kilometers. That's over 13,000 miles. More than double the commonly cited figure. It's long enough to stretch more than halfway around the entire circumference of the Earth. But, and this is the detail almost nobody includes when they repeat that impressive number, that 21,196 kilometer figure counts every wall ever built by every dynasty across 2 millennia, including sections that no longer physically connect to each other, sections separated by hundreds of miles of nothing, sections built in completely different centuries for completely different emperors, who in some cases weren't even trying to defend against the same enemies. It is not one wall. It has never been one wall. Referring to the Great Wall as a singular structure is a bit like referring to the Great Fence of the United States, and meaning every fence ever built by every US state government since 1776, laid end to end. The version most tourists actually walk on, photograph and picture in their heads, the dramatic stone battlements snaking dramatically across mountain ridges near Beijing, is almost entirely Ming Dynasty construction, built primarily between the 14th and 17th centuries. That's the newest major phase of wall building, not the oldest. The earliest wall fragments, built by separate warring states centuries before China was even unified, used cheaper, faster construction, rammed earth, tamped down in wooden frames, sometimes reinforced with reeds or branches. Much of that earlier material has simply weathered away over 20-some centuries, because unlike Ming-era brick and stone, packed earth doesn't survive 2,000 years of rain, wind and temperature swings particularly well. And here's a fact that undercuts the entire ancient wonder standing proud since antiquity image. A 2016 survey by the Great Wall of China Society found that roughly 30% of the Ming-era wall, again the newest, sturdiest, most photogenic portion, had already vanished. Not eroded a little, gone. Reduced to rubble, buried under farmland or, in some well-documented cases, physically dismantled by nearby villagers who needed stone and brick for their own houses, roads and barns, and figured a 2,000-year-old wall nobody was using anymore was as good a quarry as any. This wasn't ancient looting. Some of this demolition happened within living memory in the 20th century, sometimes with tacit local approval, sometimes during periods of political upheaval when preserving imperial-era monuments was actively discouraged. So the Great Wall of China, you picture, is simultaneously longer than you thought, older than you thought in some places, newer than you thought in others, mostly disconnected rather than continuous, and actively disappearing in real time, even as millions of tourists walk its most preserved sections every year. Reality, it turns out, needed no exaggeration. It just needed someone to actually measure it. The entire mythology around the Great Wall rests on one core assumption: that it worked. That it was an impenetrable line of defense, keeping the civilized agricultural heartland of China safe from the nomadic horsemen of the northern steppe. It's a beautiful, simple story, the wall as a 2,000-year-old shield. It's also, in the most important instances that actually mattered to Chinese history, false. Start with the most famous failure, because it's almost darkly funny. In 1644, the Ming dynasty, the dynasty responsible for most of the wall you can visit today, was collapsing from the inside. Peasant rebellions were tearing the empire apart. One rebel army had already seized the capital, and the Ming's last real hope of holding the throne rested on a general named Wu Sangui, who commanded the garrison at Shanhai Pass, the easternmost anchor point of the entire wall, the fortress where the Great Wall meets the sea. Wu Sangui was in an impossible position. Behind him, a hostile rebel army that had just overthrown his emperor. In front of him, beyond the wall, the Manchu people, a rival power that had been kept out by that very wall for generations. Faced with an enemy on both sides, Wu Sangui made a choice that no wall in human history could have defended against. He opened the gate. He personally allowed the Manchu army through Shanhai Pass, inviting the very force the wall existed to keep out, because in the moment they seemed like the lesser threat, or, depending on which historical account you trust, because the rebels had reportedly taken his family hostage, or because he calculated the Manchus would help him retake the capital and then simply leave. They did help him take back the capital, they did not leave. The Manchus used that open gate to march straight into the heart of China, and within months they had installed their own ruling dynasty, the Qing, which would then rule China for the next 268 years. Read that again. The single most consequential invasion in the history of the wall's supposed purpose wasn't a case of the wall being climbed, tunneled under, or breached by siege engines. It was a door that a Chinese general opened himself from the inside because the geopolitics of the moment made an enemy outside the wall look safer than the chaos happening within it. No fortification on Earth, no matter how tall or how long, can defend against the person holding the keys deciding to let you in. And Wu Sangui isn't even an isolated case. Centuries earlier, the Mongol armies under Genghis Khan didn't need to breach the wall at all in most of their major campaigns into northern China. They went around sections of it, exploited weakly garrisoned stretches, or simply overwhelmed and bribed local commanders the same way Wu Sangui's story would later play out. A wall, no matter how long, is only as strong as the discipline, loyalty, and manpower of the soldiers stationed along it and stretched across thousands of miles of mountainous terrain. No dynasty in Chinese history ever had enough soldiers to fully garrison every mile at once. There were always gaps, there were always weak points, and weak points throughout history are where humans, not walls, decide the outcome. This is really the uncomfortable core truth. The Great Wall as impenetrable shield myth glosses over. The wall was never primarily a wall in the sense of a solid, unbroken barrier that physically stopped armies the way a dam stops water. Historians who study it now describe its real function as something closer to a filtration and early warning system. It slowed down raiding parties, especially fast-moving nomadic cavalry, whose entire military advantage was speed and mobility, which the wall directly disrupted by forcing horses to find gates, ford rivers, or navigate mountain passes instead of sweeping freely across open plains. It gave defenders elevated positions, watchtowers, and signal fire relay stations that let word of an incoming force travel to the capital far faster than the invading army itself could move. And it functioned as a customs and trade control mechanism as much as a military one, a way to regulate who crossed between the agricultural Chinese heartland and the nomadic steppe, taxing and monitoring movement rather than sealing it off entirely. In other words, the Great Wall of China was never meant to be, and never functioned as, an unbreakable shield. It was a very long, very expensive early warning and speed bump system, genuinely effective at that specific job, but nowhere near as absolute as the mythology suggests. The wall didn't fail because it was poorly built. It failed in the moments that mattered most to Chinese history, because walls can't stop human decisions, and every empire that ever relied on it eventually discovered that the most dangerous breach point was never a weak spot in the masonry. It was a person. Now we get to the legend that refuses to die no matter how many historians push back on it, the claim that the Great Wall of China is, quite literally, the longest cemetery on Earth. That workers who died during construction weren't buried separately, but were entombed directly inside the wall itself, their bodies used almost as building material, sealed inside the rammed earth and stone to save time and effort. This image is genuinely everywhere in popular culture, in documentaries, in travel articles, in offhand comments tour guides sometimes make for dramatic effect. And like most durable myths, it isn't built from nothing. It's built from a real, well-documented, genuinely horrifying historical truth that got exaggerated into something even more sensational than the reality, which honestly was already bad enough. Here's the true part. The human cost of building the Great Wall, particularly the earliest major unified construction phase under China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, in the 3rd century BCE, was catastrophic. Historical Chinese texts, including the work of the ancient historian Sima Qian, writing roughly a century later, describe forced conscription of laborers on a massive scale. Hundreds of thousands of peasants, convicts and soldiers pulled from their homes and marched to the northern frontier to build fortifications under brutal conditions. Extreme cold, inadequate food, dangerous terrain, and merciless work quotas enforced by officials who answered to an emperor obsessed with completing the project. Estimates for the total number of people who died during Qin-era wall construction range enormously depending on the source. Some traditional estimates run as high as several 100,000 or even into the millions across the full span of construction, though modern historians treat the highest of these figures with real skepticism, since ancient chroniclers had every incentive to dramatize the cruelty of a dynasty that later rulers wanted to paint as a monstrous, discredited predecessor. What's much harder to dispute is that death tolls were severe, that laborers were often worked to death deliberately or through sheer negligence, and that the wall's construction is remembered in Chinese folk memory as an act of immense state cruelty inflicted on ordinary people. That folk memory produced one of the most enduring legends in all of Chinese storytelling, the tale of Meng Jiangnu, a woman whose husband was conscripted to build the wall and never returned. In the legend, she travels to the wall herself to find him, only to learn he has died during construction and been buried within the wall's structure. Her grief, in the most famous version of the story, is so overwhelming that her weeping physically collapses a section of the wall, revealing her husband's bones underneath. It's a folk tale, not a historical record. But folk tales like this one are exactly how a real documented tragedy, mass forced labor, mass death, crystallizes over centuries into a more literal, more visceral claim that bodies aren't just associated with the wall's history, but are physically inside it, structurally, as mortar and filler. Modern archaeology tells a more complicated, less Gothic story. Extensive excavation and geological analysis of surviving Qin and Han-era wall sections have not turned up evidence supporting the idea that corpses were routinely used as structural building material, packed into the rammed earth core, the way the legend implies. The wall's construction techniques, particularly the tamped earth method used in the oldest sections, involved layering soil and compacting it under enormous pressure in wooden frames. Archaeologists studying these layers have generally found organic remains to be rare and inconsistent with the idea of mass, deliberate body disposal as construction. Where remains have been found near wall sites, the evidence more often points to nearby burial grounds and mass graves adjacent to construction camps, which is still a grim, real historical horror. Worker communities dying in such numbers that they required their own dedicated burial sites near the frontier, rather than bodies literally mixed into the wall's fabric as building material. So which version is true? In a sense, both and neither. It is genuinely true and well documented that a staggering number of people died building the Great Wall under conditions of forced, often lethal labor. This is not conspiracy or exaggeration. It's one of the darker, more solidly attested facts in the wall's entire history. It does not appear to be literally true that their bodies were entombed as mortar inside the wall's core structure the way the popular legend claims. The myth took a real atrocity and gave it an even more visceral, more quotable form, which is often exactly how myths get their staying power. Hundreds of thousands died from brutal forced labor and exposure during construction is a true, damning historical fact. Their bodies are literally inside the wall you're walking on is a more vivid, more shareable sentence, and vivid, shareable sentences survive centuries of retelling far better than accurate, but slightly less cinematic ones do. Once you understand how much genuine mystery and misinformation already surrounds the Great Wall, its true length disputed until 2012, its purpose more complicated than keep invaders out, its darkest chapter both true and mythologized simultaneously, it becomes much easier to understand why the wall has become such fertile ground for outright conspiracy theories, the kind that go well beyond honest historical confusion into genuinely fringe territory. One of the more persistent claims circulating in pseudo-archaeology and alternative history circles involves the wall's true age and purpose, arguing that portions of the structure, or structures that predate it in the same region, are dramatically older than mainstream archaeology accepts, sometimes tying this into broader ancient advanced civilization narratives that pop up around monuments worldwide, from the pyramids to Stonehenge to, inevitably, the Great Wall. These theories typically point to construction techniques or stone-fitting methods in isolated sections and argue they show a level of sophistication that couldn't possibly match the technology available to the dynasty officially credited with that section, followed by speculation about lost civilizations or, in the more extreme corners of the internet, extraterrestrial assistance. Mainstream Chinese and international archaeology roundly rejects these claims. The construction techniques found across the wall's various sections, rammed earth, brick and mortar work, stone block fitting, are well within the documented engineering capabilities of the successive dynasties who built them and match construction methods used in other verified structures from the same eras. But the theories persist online largely because the wall's genuinely confusing, multi-century, multi-dynasty construction history, the very complexity we've spent this entire video unpacking, makes it easy for bad faith or simply uninformed claims to sound plausible to viewers who don't already know how patchwork the real history is. A separate, more politically charged strand of conspiracy and revisionist commentary reframes the wall's entire purpose, arguing, sometimes seriously, sometimes as pointed political commentary rather than genuine historical claim, that its real function throughout history was less about keeping northern invaders out and more about controlling the movement of Chinese peasants and laborers, preventing internal migration and consolidating state control over ordinary people's freedom of movement, trade and information. There's a kernel of legitimate historical truth buried in this framing. As we discussed, the wall absolutely did function as a customs and border control mechanism, taxing and regulating trade and travel between regions, not purely a military barrier. But the more extreme versions of this claim, arguing the wall was essentially built primarily as a tool of internal oppression with defense as a secondary or fabricated justification, go well beyond what the historical and archaeological record actually supports. Most serious historians view the wall's defensive purpose as genuine and primary, particularly during periods of active nomadic incursion, even while acknowledging its secondary administrative and trade control functions. Then there's a stranger, more recent category of online claim that the Great Wall as we know it today is substantially a modern reconstruction, sometimes framed as an accusation that entire ancient sections were effectively rebuilt from scratch in the 20th century and misleadingly presented to tourists as untouched antiquity. This one, unlike the others, brushes up against something genuinely true, just wildly overstated. Large sections of the wall that tourists visit today, particularly the heavily trafficked Badaling section outside Beijing. The very first section opened to international tourism in 1957, have indeed undergone extensive restoration, some of it significant enough that a meaningful percentage of the visible stonework is modern replacement rather than original Ming-era material. This isn't a secret or a cover-up. It's openly documented by the Chinese heritage authorities responsible for the restoration work, done partly to stabilize crumbling sections for public safety and partly, frankly, to make the most visited stretches look more dramatically impressive for tourism. But some heavily visited tourist sections have been significantly restored, which is publicly documented, is a very different, far less sinister claim than the entire wall is essentially a 20th century fabrication, which is how the theory sometimes gets exaggerated online. The truth, once again, sits in an uncomfortable middle distance between ancient and untouched, and entirely fake, genuinely old in its foundations and root, genuinely altered and rebuilt in many of its most photographed sections. What almost all of these theories share, if you step back and look at them together, is the same underlying pattern. A genuinely complicated, contested, imperfectly documented historical structure gets simplified by popular culture into something clean and mythic, a single ancient wall, one purpose, one story, and then, when people encounter the messier reality later, that gap between the myth and the truth becomes exactly the space where conspiracy theories, exaggerations, and pseudo-history thrive. The Great Wall didn't need aliens or hidden ancient civilizations to be extraordinary. It needed 2,000 years, dozens of dynasties, hundreds of thousands of forced laborers, an unknown number of deaths, at least one catastrophic betrayal from within its own gates, and a level of genuine engineering ambition that remains almost incomprehensible even now that we've finally, properly measured the thing. So let's put it back together, stripped of the myths. The Great Wall of China is not visible from space with the naked eye, not from low orbit, and certainly not from the moon, a claim so wildly exaggerated it predates actual spaceflight by more than a century. It is not one wall, but a sprawling, disconnected network of walls built across more than 2,000 years by multiple rival and successive dynasties, only properly measured in full for the first time in 2012, when it turned out to be more than twice as long as the figure most people still repeat. Large sections of it, including sections built as recently as the Ming Dynasty just a few centuries ago, have already crumbled, been dismantled by local villagers for building material, or vanished into the landscape entirely, meaning the wall isn't just an ancient relic, it's an actively disappearing one. It did not function as an unbreakable barrier. Its most consequential failure in Chinese history came not from an army breaching its walls, but from a single general opening its gates from the inside at Shanhai Pass in 1644. Inviting in the very dynasty the wall existed to keep out. Its construction did come at a horrifying human cost, with forced laborers dying in numbers historians still argue about, but the specific visceral image of bodies literally built into its walls as mortar appears to be folklore layered onto a real atrocity rather than a literal archaeological fact. And the fringe theories that have grown up around it: ancient aliens, secret modern fabrication, hidden political conspiracies, mostly thrive in the genuine gaps and complexities of a structure whose true history was, for most of the public, essentially unknown until very recently. None of that makes the Great Wall of China less impressive. If anything, it makes it more impressive because the real story doesn't need embellishment. Over 21,000 kilometers of fortification, watchtowers and garrisons built by hand across some of the most punishing terrain on the planet, sustained across 2 millennia and multiple collapsing and rising dynasties, is already one of the largest sustained engineering projects in human history, with or without being visible from space, with or without being a single unbroken structure, with or without a perfect record of keeping every invader out. The myth promised something clean: one wall, one purpose, visible from the heavens, unbreakable for 2,000 years. The truth is messier, more human, and honestly more haunting: a patchwork monument built by forced hands, betrayed from within by its own defenders, slowly disappearing even as millions of tourists walk across the parts still standing, unaware that the ground beneath their feet has a different, stranger story than the one printed on the plaque beside the path. If this kind of myth-busting deep dive is something you want more of, let me know in the comments which monument or historical fact you want taken apart next. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing, because there are a lot more of these coming.